The food industry makes 700 billion, but we lose 1.9 trillion cleaning up their mess. That is unsustainable. And that's why healthcare has gone to hell in a handbasket, is because the food industry makes the disease, and then big pharma is only happy to treat it because that's how they make their profit. But the gross profit margin of the food industry is 45%. Pharma is only at 21%. So food is actually twice as lucrative as pharma. Well, the fact of the matter is they're not going to give this up without a fight. And so people have to understand what's going on and why everyone's getting sick.
This is a topic that is near and dear to your heart for sure, and something that I am fascinated in. And it's the idea of when we think about metabolic health and wellness, a lot of times the conversation is very focused on micro factors, like what's in front of us, a piece of cake, a bag of potato chips, and all these things. But when you really pull out, there's the idea of the macroeconomics that have contributed for so many years to lead us into this poor metabolic health crisis that we face as a world. And so when we really dig in, this can turn into a bit of a rant, but it's this idea of big everything. So I thought it would be interesting to dig into big food, a little bit of big pharma, but really focus on big sugar and some of the things that have happened over the course of a number of years to get us to this point where people can start to understand, like, hey, how do we get into this pickle in the first place? So that might be a way of setting everything up. But the question for you is, how far back should we take this rant?
Well, we can take it back pretty far, Ben. This is a uh, problem that is not exclusive to the food story. This is a problem in the petroleum story. This is a problem in the tobacco story. This is a problem in the opioids story. Um, there are dark forces at work, and they are making money. And so they want things to stay status quo. And so they have very specific playbooks. And we've seen the data. We've seen their playbooks. Um, so we know they exist. This isn't, figment of our imagination, and we've caught them in their own lies as well. So, you know, understanding the organization and how this gets played out and who's participating and who's paid off is extraordinarily important to understanding how we got into the mess that we're in. And I'm very happy to talk about it. And I've actually written articles and books, in fact, like Metabolical, about this exact question.
Yeah, and a lot of it's touched on in Hacking of the American Mind too. So why don't we start out with defining big, right? Just it might be a term that people have heard, big tobacco, big oil, but the idea of like what exactly is big. So framing it as conglomerates or these large corporations that often collude to influence policy, focus on profits over people. And big spans, as you mentioned, it can span food, pharma, oil, sugar, tobacco, list goes on.
That's right. So let's first of all talk about what we mean by collusion. All right. So there's a difference between a plot and a conspiracy. They're not the same. A conspiracy is an organized consortium of either individuals or companies with a common uh, goal, working together to defraud the public, or or some other entity, with a mission of malice. We have no data to say that there is a conspiracy for any of these things. Okay, not for oil, not for tobacco, not for um, uh, uh, opioids, not for alcohol, not for sugar, not for food, and not for pharma. We do not have data for conspiracy. We have plenty of data for plot. The fact is that each company looks at what every other company does and says, that's what we have to do. And so they are not organized in the sense of, you know, running a cartel to defraud the public, but they are all defrauding the public individually. So the ultimate answer is the same, but looking for signs of collusion will end up being fruitless.
So why don't we take it to a place that you've probably spent a lot of time thinking about, 1943.
Yes,
1943, the SRF, the Sugar Research Foundation, is is founded, and we know that the SRF, you can see the smile gleaming on your face because you've probably thought so much about this and have lots to say. They funded more than 300 industry research studies between 43 and 72, which was a critical period in the way that we thought about sugar as a society and the downstream implications of it. So why don't we start there? And there's lots to go into, 50s all the way to the 60s, 70s, and talk about that.
right. So I'm going to start by saying I don't know why the Sugar Research Foundation engaged in all of this uh, subterfuge and funding of industry sponsored studies back in 1943. Did they know that their product was dangerous back in 1943? I don't know. I actually don't know. I do know that that's when the Sugar Research Foundation started and it became an international sugar research foundation um, at about shortly thereafter. So clearly, there was reason for the various sugar companies to band together, in this consortium arrangement to try to promote their product. Um, and they started funding studies. Now, up to that point, industry had not funded scientific studies. So they were really the first to do that. There were plenty of uh, pharmaceutical studies. That's true, but they were funding their own studies. They weren't funding other people's studies. So, like for instance, IG Farben, the famous maker of Zyklon B, from World War II, the nerve gas that they used in the concentration camps. They funded a lot of research, but it was all, you know, pharmaceutical research within their own company. And of course, lots of other pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and what have you. But this was the first time when an industry sponsored science outside of themselves. And I don't know why, but I do know that they did it, and I do know that they continue to do it even today. And we have the data as to how that happens, and they're supposed to disclose, and they don't always disclose. So this is a well-worn uh, tactic on their part, and the reason they're doing it is to pollute the literature. They are basically paying for studies that say that their product is not dangerous. And the more studies that they can say that says that their product is not dangerous, then when you do a meta-analysis, which is a conglomeration of multiple analyses in an attempt to try to answer questions, then those studies play an outsized role in basically bringing everything to the mean, regressing it to the mean, and basically therefore proving the null hypothesis that basically there's no harm. So this is a statistical effort on their part to exonerate their product when they think that there is a problem with their product. And the chemical industry, the petroleum industry, et cetera, have all engaged in this. And we now have the data, like for instance, for oil. If you read Naomi Oreskes, she, has gone back, as early as 1968. You know, Exxon and Mobil knew about this problem back in the late 1960s, even before the first Earth Day. They knew about this. and they started publishing the issue, and then someone, I don't know who, in the oil business said, this isn't very good for us. And they put the big clamp on it. And they actually then started, you know, with their own uh, disinformation campaign, telling people that this was, not an issue and that we should ignore it. And of course, we continued to burn fossil fuels at, enormous rates. And now we have, the climate change disaster that we have. So, and I've actually been approached by some of these people. One guy I remember took me to dinner to basically convince me that fossil fuels were not the problem. And it was an interesting argument, to say the least. And now I know why, because that was his job. So I get it. I get it. I know what's happening. All right. So 1943 is when this all started. Then in 1954, the Tobacco Research Foundation to realized they had a problem because of the Richard Dahl paper, and also with Austin Bradford Hill back in the UK, realizing that was the first indication in 1950 that tobacco might be associated with lung cancer, and they needed to do something about it because this was clearly not good for their publicity or for their product. At that same moment, a member of the uh, Sugar Research Foundation, who was actually a professor at MIT, and um, I take umbrage with this because I'm an MIT grad and I love MIT, but this one guy, he needs to pay for his crimes, and his name was Robert Hockett. And he approached the Tobacco Research Foundation and showed them the playbook that the Sugar Research Foundation had been using for the previous 10 years. And he then went to work for the Tobacco Research Foundation to do the same thing in terms of covering up and, engaging in this disinformation campaign. And so the Tobacco Research Foundation used the same playbook as sugar, as opposed to sugar using the same playbook as tobacco. And they were both doing it at the same time with the same people. And my colleagues at UCSF, Kristen Carnes, Laura Schmidt, Stan Glantz, and all the people in the Tobacco Research Documents Library, which is now also the Food Industry Documents Library at UCSF, are actually conducting a digital etymological analysis of all of the documents from Big Tobacco and from Big Sugar to determine, using the phraseology of these documents, like what they wrote and how they wrote it, as to whether or not there was collusion between these two industries and who was involved and who was in charge of it.
Interesting.
So that's going on right now as we speak. And I can't wait for the results of this analysis.
So let's go into the 50s, so early 50s. The SRF started to find a link between CHD, so coronary heart disease, and sugar. They're finding a link, and they seem to bury that information pretty deeply to the point where they funded an animal experiment, Project 259, to evaluate sucrose's effects on cardiovascular health. Ended up blocking the results from getting published because they weren't in the best interest of industry, air quotes industry, like the entire industry.
That's
So instead they sponsored a study on CHD in 60, I think it was 65, that linked cholesterol. Cholesterol is a problem. And that's when fat turned into the demon and sugar was the hero of the story, and published those results in the New England Journal of Medicine.
right. So that's almost correct. Um, so first of all, 1955, Eisenhower had a heart attack, and everybody in the country started paying attention to the fact that cardiovascular disease was going up like wildfire. Okay. From the 1900s to the 1950s, there had been an enormous increase in cardiovascular disease. Now, remember, there was also an enormous increase in smoking. There was also an enormous increase in the use of trans fats. Okay. 1911, Crisco. 1920 started appearing in baked goods, the Twinkies, 1950s. So this was, there were several issues, tied up in heart disease. But as you probably know, there was this guy back in the 1950s who started this work in 1952 by the name of Ansel Keys. And he was convinced that it was saturated fat that was the bad guy. And the reason he said that was because he was a Minnesota epidemiologist and he had done sabbaticals in two places. In 1952, he did a sabbatical in England and he saw all of these Brits getting heart disease and he was convinced it was the fish and chips.
Mm.
And he then went to Pioppi, Italy, and he saw very little heart disease. And he also saw that they ate, they did olive oil. They didn't have that much meat in their diet. And they also didn't have any pasta, by the way. And they also didn't have any sugar, by the way, while we're at it. So he was convinced that the reason the Brits were getting sick and the people in Pioppi weren't was because of saturated fat. And he went out to prove this. So this was well known in the in the echelons, and the sugar industry was worried that you know their product was going to end up being implicated because of a British physiologist, nutritionist, physician by the name of John Yudkin, who had in 1957 started publishing papers fingering sugar as the primary driver. Now, Yudkin did not have causational data. He only had correlational data. But the correlational data was pretty good, you know, and we've learned that causation and correlation are not the same thing. But back then, we sort of didn't understand from a statistical standpoint the difference between the two. So they were worried. And so they had to do something. So Keyes was out there yelling about saturated fat. Yudkin was out there yelling about sugar. And the Sugar Research Foundation had to put their thumb on the scale. And so what they did was they went to the Harvard School of Public Health, Department of Nutrition, which had been started in 1942 by a gentleman by the name of Fred Stare, Stare, very famous in this field. And they said, you know that it's saturated fat, don't you? And Stare said, oh, absolutely, I know that. And they said, well, we would like the rest of the world to know this too. And so we would like for you and your two assistants, Mark Hegsted and McGandy, I can't remember his first name, to write two review articles. So they were review articles, not scientific studies, review articles in the New England Journal of Medicine that exonerate sugar and finger saturated fat as the bad guy. And Stare said, how much? And they ended up saying 6,500 American dollars, which today's money would be worth 50,000. And so that's exactly what Stare, Hegsted, and McGandy did. And they wrote these two articles basically exonerating sugar and figuring saturated fat. They ignored all of the data that Yudkin had and instead basically focused on saturated fat. And of course, the Sugar Research Foundation did not disclose the fact that they were the funders of this and that they were also receiving drafts and editing and adding references very specifically to, form a bulwark against Yudkin and, the sugar hypothesis of heart disease. In fact, they they funded many studies by many different people, and when they didn't like the results that they were seeing, they made sure that those studies never saw the light of day. And my colleague Kristen Carnes at UCSF is now actually researching that and finding out all of the studies that the Sugar Research Foundation funded but never came to publication, to figure out exactly why, whether or not it was inconclusive versus whether it actually showed problems in the data. And I've been working with her on a couple of these papers to figure this out. There's one guy who was in the pocket of Big Sugar named St. Clair. It was back in 1971. There was one study done which showed that sugar was associated with bladder cancer in rats, never got published. There's a whole bunch. So we know that this was a major portion of what the Sugar Research Foundation was involved in, was basically obfuscating the truth and promoting their own narrative throughout, and by buying off scientists.
Yeah, and some of the studies that are being done, so there's the ones where they're finding data that does not support a strong position for the sugar industry. And then they're doing these other ones, like one that I found recently was from 2018, and it's just absurd to think about it, but it's basically marketing propaganda where it's Mary, I think the title is Mary Poppins Was Right. Adding small amounts of sugar or salt reduces the bitterness of vegetables. So it's targeted at parents and like, hey, this is supporting why we should have a little bit of sugar in those fruit pouches and feed them to your kids at a certain age. So it's they're doing these things that are basically trying to dupe people or influence their thought process to rationalize, like, hey, yeah, maybe it actually is okay or it's not that bad. Like, so they find there's almost two sides. There's like we find terrible data and we don't want to publish it and we'll do anything not to. And then we're going to do these things that are just sort of these marketing pushes to make people think it's not as harmful as it is. And it really feels like everyone's having the wool pulled over their eyes. And you need people like Kristen or Stanton Glantz, like these people that are basically investigating what's going on to say, we're all being duped. Like, this is how we're being duped, and uncovering some of the links between big everything.
Absolutely. So the dark forces of industry use many different tactics and different techniques to sort of get their way, and we now have exposed each of them, and we know what's going on. But they still do it, and um, there's no enforcement. There's nothing on the uh, on the you know prosecution side for being able to do this, because it's considered free speech. They're allowed to say these things, and what are you going to do if a scientist decides not to publish a study? Who's going to get thrown in jail for that? You know, so this they play on this. Let me give you a list that I made years ago of all the methods that the dark force uses, and I'll give a little description of each one and how it works. So first of all, shoddy science. Okay, like for instance, Snackwells. Okay, and they're still with us. All right, they say they replace the fat to make them low fat. Well, what do they replace them with? They replace them with sugar. It actually turns out that there's more calories in each cookie than there was before. There's just less fat. So they took 2 grams of fat down, 13 grams of carbohydrate up, and 4 of which are added sugar. So, like, not a good idea. Same with chocolate milk. So they take the fat out of the milk. Well, now the milk tastes like dishwater. So what do? They put chocolate or strawberry in it so that the kids will drink it. Turns out dairy fat is actually protective against heart disease and diabetes, because it's different. It's odd chain fatty acids with a different phospholipid signature than standard red meat saturated fat. So it's actually protective. It's actually good. Well, we take it out and then we put something that's harmful in. So shoddy science to start with. Buying off scientists. Well, I just described what happened with Fred Astaire, Mark Hegstead, and McGandy. Co-opting critics. So, like, who would be the biggest critic that would have some stature? Well, the dietitians. So it turns out that the American Dietetic Association, which morphed into the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics back in 2012 or so, they get 90% of their operating budget from big food. So then they're not going to bite the hand that feeds them. All right. And we actually have the data to show how the AND has basically been co opted over these years because of their relationship with big food. The worst offender by far and away is the School Nutrition Association. Okay, these guys are actually downright evil, and they run all the school cafeterias in America. And school cafeterias are the largest fast food franchise in the entire world. And these people are in charge of your kids' nutrition. They have to go. Okay. If anybody has to go, it's them. All right. Weakening government oversight. All right. And that's been done in whole bunches of ways, including the GRASS list. So the generally recognized as safe list used to only have 170 items on it when it started in 1958. Do you know how many things are on the GRASS list today? 10,000. Do you really think there are 10,000 things you can put in your body that won't kill you?
Chance.
Right? Well, why did this happen? Well, the food industry. Okay. The Food Safety Modernization Act of 1997 basically put food safety in the hands of the industry rather than in the hands of the government. Okay. Disaster. Disaster. Market saturation. Okay. When all of the items in the supermarket aisles have added sugar in them, okay, you actually don't have a choice because everything has it, and that's the level we're at now. And it's done on purpose, and it's not because there's one entity doing that. It's that every entity is looking at every other entity. So General Mills is looking at what Kellogg's is doing, and they're basically matching, because it's share of stomach. They want their piece, as it were. So that's a big problem. Um, AstroTurf groups. So there are groups called Citizens for Health, the American Legislative Exchange Council. These are all food industry sponsored um, groups that are influencing Congress, calling themselves grassroots organizations, but they are nothing of the sort. And their job is basically to lobby Congress to keep things the way they are. Marketing to children. So, is marketing to children legal? It is absolutely legal. Is marketing to children ethical? It is highly unethical. Now, we know from numerous studies that children cannot tell the difference between the commercial and the TV show until 8 years of age. So they don't know when they're being marketed to. Is that fair? One of the reasons that the industry says that it's free speech is because you assume that people are allowed to speak freely and then other people are allowed to either filter it out or accept it, that the onus is on the listener. But if the listener is under age 8, then that doesn't work. So in 1979, I think it was 79, 78, 79, the Federal Trade Commission tried to restrict marketing of junk food to children. It's a famous scandal called the Kidvid debacle. Kidvid. And the FTC had launched a whole bunch of hearings in Congress. Well, the food industry went so friggin' ballistic They pulled out all their big guns and they lobbied every single member of Congress. And not only did they get Congress, the FTC, to stop the the effort, but they actually got Congress to pass the FTC Modernization Act, which took the enforcement arm of the FTC away, and they became only an advisory organization. They declawed the FTC. So, have you ever heard of the FTC doing anything since? And the reason is because they can't, because Congress basically took that away from them because big food did that. All right. And so basically, there is no enforcement. There's nobody to tell big food what's going on. And then finally, the most egregious of all, spyware. In Mexico, when the soda tax was being put into place, have you heard about this Israeli spyware that they can put on cell phones and they can track everything? Right? Well, they actually did that to all the members of the Instituto Nacional de Salud Pública, the Institute of Public
Mm.
Health in Cuernavaca, Mexico, that were actually working on trying to get a Mexico soda tax, and El Poder de Consumidor, which is the public relations nonprofit that sprung up to basically educate the public about the evils of sugar and the relation between sugar and diabetes. This is really really bad. Okay, so the bottom line is the food industry, and now of course we have the tobacco industry and the opioids industry and the oil industry, they don't want to play. They do not want to change. They want their money. And we've seen it. We've seen it. And we've seen them get in trouble. And, they don't care because they've basically declawed, the agencies that would effectively regulate them.
So why don't we go into this idea of the processed food industry and where some of the foundational fissures started. So early 70s, Nixon is up for re-election and decides that there's going to be a policy implemented around incentivizing farmers on quantity, not quality of crops, really digging into this idea of corn. And so I think he had worked with, it was Earl Butz, I
Earl
believe.
Butz. Earl Butz was the Secretary of Agriculture under Nixon. That's right.
And the idea was to push forward corn, like to really promote corn and all of these downstream implications about corn being this commodity crop and this filler. Well, that led to corn syrup and the list goes on. So why don't we'll leave it there. You take it away from early 70s and how the processed food industry evolved and some of the thoughts that happened around it.
Right. So I remember you're Ben, you're way too young. I remember TV show every Saturday morning on New York TV. It was I mean it was national, but I lived in New York, called College Bowl, and different colleges, basically, this basically trivia, like Jeopardy for college students. And I was a kid, and I used to watch that religiously. And the and College Bowl was always sponsored by General Mills and Kellogg's and this company that I didn't understand what they did, named ADM, Archer Daniels Midland. And boy, oh boy, did they have a lot of commercials for ADM. And they showed all these tractors rolling through through Iowa, and collecting all the corn and all this. This was the late 60s. The bottom line was that in the late 60s, farmers in Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, etc., they farmed different products. They farmed corn, of course, they farmed soy, of course, but they also farmed vegetables, they farmed tomatoes, they farmed, a whole host of different things for the country. And in order to do that, they had to rotate crops. They had to basically let some land lie fallow in order to sort of regenerate the soil so that the microbiome in the soil could support the difference between dirt and soil. Dirt is just you know carbon and silicon, whereas soil has living organisms and minerals and amino acids and other stuff. And so that's what Miracle Grow is basically all that stuff put in a bottle. All right. Well, the point is you had to regenerate the soil. So you had to basically rotate the crops and you had to let some fields lie fallow. And that's what happened um, through the late 60s and they were all family farms. And, there was a science or an art, to how to, improve your yield. And then Richard Nixon, he had um, uh, a problem. Okay. It was called political unrest. And he had a lot of it because of Vietnam and everything else. And he also had fluctuating food prices. And fluctuating food prices cause political unrest. And if we didn't learn that before, we certainly learned that when the price of rice went up in Thailand, when we converted corn to ethanol in the 2008, it caused rice riots in Thailand and caused the ouster of their prime minister. All right. So we had this globalization and, fluctuating food prices. Nothing makes people more unhappy than fluctuating food prices. And so Nixon, in an attempt to try to stabilize food prices, he told his agriculture secretary, Earl Butz, his nickname was Rusty Butz. I love that. To make food cheap and do whatever you have to make food cheap so that this issue of political unrest would get better. Because after all, he was running for re-election in 72. And so Butz, devised a plan that basically we were going to do monoculture. We were going to basically increase the yield on every farm, and we were not going to let anything lie fallow. And what we're going to do is we're going to pump all those farms full of ammonium nitrate, full of petroleum fertilizer, to get the nitrogen into the soil so that we could grow, crappy food, but nonetheless more food. And so he went to the heartland, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, etc. And he said three things: row to row, furrow to furrow, get big or get out. And that was the end of crop rotation. That was the end of, lying fallow. It was also the end of ADM's sponsorship of College Bowl. That was when they stopped sponsoring it. All right. Because now they had a different, set of directives, as it were. And of course, that was also around the time that we started learning about this thing coming out of Japan called high fructose corn syrup. And the process for being able to turn glucose in corn into a higher concentration of fructose, an enzymatic uh, process using an enzyme called glucose oxidase. So more corn equals more better. And, the goal now was to increase yield. And the government stopped paying the farmers to not grow specific items. It stopped paying them to, for lying fallow. So there was a completely new price model. There was a completely new business model that was put in place that went on quantity, not on quality. It was all about yield. And basically, to be honest with you, that is still in place today. And so we continue to, cover the entire Missouri River Valley in in petroleum pet, fertilizer, which then the nitrogen runoff kills the Gulf of Mexico. That's why there's dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, is because we have to basically support the corn and soy that's in Iowa with, petroleum fertilizer. So, basically, these are the unintended consequences of, these irrational, policies that, were poorly thought out.
Is that when in the early 70s when all this was happening, is that when there was collusion with companies like Monsanto in encouraging people to go to monoculture, like farmers to go to monoculture and really, like, prohibiting them from doing any seed saving, like, all the things that you should do if you're growing multiple crops and trying to encourage or trying to, um, focus on the quality of food, seed saving, like tilling soil properly.
Well, that certainly happened in the 1970s. Monsanto was a slightly different story. I mean, obviously, they've always been supporting American agriculture in some fashion or other. But really, Monsanto ended up becoming the bad guy in the story when we started with GMOs. Okay. And that was not in the 70s. Molecular biology was, just basically coming of age in the 80s. And Monsanto basically, you know, developed various seed products that, were uh, for instance, Roundup ready, and so you could spray pesticides but still grow your corn. And that's when we got into even bigger trouble. Now, as it turns out, those pesticides have effects on us, um, like, for instance, glyphosate, or Roundup. Um, Glyphosate is an amino acid analog. It is an analog of glycine, and it gets into our proteins. And now, and it affects our DNA. And now we've shown that glyphosate actually is a predictor of cancer. And that's why um, Monsanto was sued for $280 million for this guy who got lymphoma from glyphosate. And then Bayer bought Monsanto, which I think was the stupidest move ever made on record. Why would you do that? But they did. I guess they thought they could weather the storm. And now Bayer owes about $109 billion, you know, in lawsuits. Like, that was really dumb. But they did it. Uh, Greed is, pretty amazing. The point is that, every single thing we do has downstream effects and unintended consequences. And the problem is that no one's looking at those, especially in industry. So is it the government's job to do that? Well, we have all sorts of environmental impact things that we have to do, before a construction project can be done, or a building project can be done, that have to be done. But the industry doesn't have to do any of those things. The question is, why not? Shouldn't they have to do that? Shouldn't they have to submit, their plan before they do that? Well, they don't, because it's food, but it isn't.
And with sugar, the wild thing is, I think you had written in Hacking of the American Mind that the margins are just ridiculous. Like, it's like 45% margins, so they're up there with, like, pharma margins, and so
Oh,
the incentives
higher.
to grow and grow and grow and to be like, to promote irrationally to promote, "Hey, this is fine for you and it's not a big deal," and it's a filler in everything, like, it causes all of the worst downstream health implications that we know of. It is as you always say, it's like the other white powder. It's addictive, it's the number one cause of metabolic syndrome, and, like, it's just I mean, it's dangerous, but your famous line, "Sugar equals love." Like, we glorify that it's this, like, beautiful thing, and we celebrate sugar, but it's and we have to look at everything with a bit of a discretionary lens saying, there are things that aren't good for you. We're not saying eliminate, like, never have a single grain of sugar in your life. It's more a matter of, like, you should avoid it altogether, but it's just the idea of it's in everything, and now it's causing huge implications for the world.
Well, look, sugar should be a condiment. Okay.
Like alcohol, right?
Or even like, spice, it's a condiment. You don't live on turmeric. Okay. It's added to certain foods, for one reason or another, or cumin or whatever, but it's not a dietary staple. Okay. Sugar's become a dietary staple. All right. You know, up to 20% of calories are sugar. It should be more like about 5% of calories. I mean, we're eating quadruple what we should be eating. But, when we went from condiment to diet staple, that's when things went disastrous. And the reason is because we have a limited capacity to metabolize it. Okay. It is not just calories, it overwhelms our mitochondria. It inhibits mitochondrial function. Mitochondria, the little energy burning factories inside all your cells that make chemical energy for your cells to power themselves. That chemical energy is called ATP. Well, sugar inhibits ATP generation. Therefore, it's making your cells sick because your cells need that ATP in order to do their functions. So, we're not supposed to eat this much. Our livers only have a limited capacity to metabolize this stuff, like alcohol. And you see what happens when you overdo alcohol. Well, same thing happens with sugar. And the reason is because alcohol and sugar metabolize the same way. And it makes sense that that would be the case because, after all, where do you get alcohol from? Fermentation of sugar. It's called wine, right? We do it in Napa and Sonoma every day. The big difference between the two is that for alcohol, the yeast does the first step in metabolism called glycolysis. For sugar, we do our own first step in metabolism. But after that, the mitochondria see the same thing. And so it makes sense that sugar and alcohol would have the same downstream diseases, and they do. And that's why children now get the diseases of alcohol, type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease, without the alcohol. Point is, we're not supposed to eat this much, but the food industry has realized that, number one, sugar sells, and they make a whole lot of money on it. If you look at the gross margin of the food industry prior to 1975, which was when the sugar glut started and and high fructose corn syrup entered our world. Prior to 1975, the annual profit margin of the food industry was 1% per year. Now, population was going up by 1% per year. That means that the food industry made more money because they sold the same amount of food to more people, same amount of food per person to more people. So they grew by, volume of people. Since 1975, the annual profit margin of the food industry is 5% per year. But in fact, birth rates have actually gone down. It's not 1% per year anymore. It's about 0.7% per year. So birth rates have gone down by about 30%. Yet the annual profit margin of the food industry has gone up fivefold. How do you explain that? Well, they have to be selling more food to fewer people. So the question is, how do you get more food into somebody? And the answer is sugar. And the reason is because it's addictive. So they've learned when they add it, you buy more.
And it's such a filler. I think that's one thing that you always talk about as well, is it's like it adds it is literally a filler. It adds calories, it adds all these things. It is energy, right? That we always
Well,
talk about.
it's not energy. Yeah, that's what they say.
Yeah, exactly, and it's just garbage.
Right, exactly. If you blow it up in a bomb calorimeter, it's energy.
Mhm.
But if you try to burn it in a mitochondria, it actually is poison. It actually inhibits energy formation. And that's the reason why the whole concept of calories is useless. My job is to kill the calorie as a unit of measure. Okay. It never made sense. It is what's wrong. Okay. And sugar is the perfect example of how it's wrong and why it's wrong. And how to basically take something that's so ensconced. For 100 years, we've been counting calories ever since 1916 when Wilbur Atwater, you know, came up with his equations that said fat had 9 calories per gram and protein had, and carbohydrate had 4 calories per gram, and basically made these calories fungible, that it didn't matter where they came from, it was just the total that mattered. Garbage. Okay, that is just garbage, and we have proof every which way from Sunday as to how garbage that is. But the fact is, food industry continues to use it because this is their juggernaut, this is their hook, and it's also the thing that shields them from culpability, because they say, well, you know, not our problem, we're just supplying the calories, you get to eat them, but the fact is we're eating so much more, and that's their fault. So this is a problem. Now, the food industry, the food industry grosses each year $1.9 trillion a year. Now, of that, 700 million is gross profit. So they're at about 40% gross profit margin. Okay, so that's gross profit, not net profit, but gross profit.
700 billion.
700 billion out of 1.9 trillion. However, medicine, the healthcare industry, loses $3.8 trillion a year, of which 75% is chronic disease driven by diet, of which 75% of that could be recoupable if we could bring levels of disease back to where they were in 1970 before the glut. In other words, 75% of 75% of 3.8 trillion is $1.9 trillion down a rat hole. The food industry makes 700 billion, but we lose 1.9 trillion cleaning up their mess. That is unsustainable. And that's why healthcare has gone to hell in a handbasket, is because the food industry makes the disease, and then big pharma is only happy to treat it because that's how they make their profit. But the gross profit margin of the food industry is 45%, 40%, 45%. Pharma is only at 21%. So food is actually twice as lucrative as pharma. So and pharma, we call them drug whores. What do we call the food industry? Well, the fact of the matter is they're not going to give this up without a fight. And so people have to understand what's going on and why everyone's getting sick. And until we, stand up and basically say no more, they'll keep doing it because there's no enforcement on.
So given sugar is addictive, given all of the factors at play, massive behavior change, massive policy change, all these things are required, and it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. It takes decades and decades. But what is, if you were to give one piece of advice, what is something that people can do? Is it read labels better? Is it lobby? Is it vote with their wallets? Like, what's sort of the thing, knowing that if we all agree, everyone sort of nods their head, they're like, I didn't realize sugar was that bad. I now have been given some foundation of education to know I should probably stay away. What would you give as one piece of advice that people could have as a takeaway?
The food industry told me a long time ago, we don't care what we sell. We just have to sell. It's about the money. It's only about the money. They sell what they sell because we buy it. Okay? So, there are two philosophies of business. One is we give the public what they want, and the other is if you build it, they will come. Which of those two does the food industry use? Both. They use both. All right? Point is, if we didn't buy it, they wouldn't sell it. The goal is to educate the public as to the evils of ultra processed food, of which sugar is the primary driver of chronic disease. If we did that, then the food industry would change. If the public demanded different. Problem is the public's not demanding different. And the reason is because prices on ultra processed food are kept low because of food subsidies. To me, food subsidies are the big evil in the room. That's what has to change. There's no economist on the planet that believes in food subsidies because they distort the market. Let the market work.
Mm.
Even libertarians can get on board with that. So if food subsidies disappeared, okay, and food could actually be sold for what it actually cost the industry to make, it would change our entire diet. It changed our entire diet back in the 1970s. We change it back. So to me, that's the thing that has to change. And until that changes, none of the other dominoes can fall. So how do you get food subsidies to change? Well, only Congress can do that. And so that's where the pressure has to be put. And that's what people have to know. Ultimately, Congress has to respond to the people. Sort of. As we've learned, not so much. And that's the real issue here.